I would like to open up the discussion more now to questions from the public and the press to our speakers and panelists, and I want to underscore the concept questions. We want to generate constructive dialogue, so if you have a comment or an interesting anecdote, please keep that to yourself. We're going to try to raise questions. We're going to start right here. Yes?
It seems to me
I'm sorry, there's a microphone going around. Yes.
it seems to me that in the fiscal rules, there may at least be some implicit assumption that there's some cyclicality, some ups and downs to the economy. Of course, Puerto Rico has been in a recession for about 10 years. It's got a declining population. Can the fiscal rules still work in an economy that's been in a long-term decline like that?
I think precisely because it is in long-term decline, you cannot have an adjustment that is anything but smart. So if on top of the structural problems Puerto Rico has, you say I'm going to have a fiscal control board that's going to force you to run a huge surplus over the next 10 years, that is the best way to make sure the island's economy tanks in a big way. So I think this is a necessary component of a recovery plan. It's not the whole recovery plan. And several of the panelists here pointed out that we're talking about fiscal because fiscal, is the issue on the table. But once you, solve fiscal or at least more or less stabilize it, you have to deal with the microeconomics of growth in the island. And it's pretty clear that there are lots of things that are not working. I have great respect for minimum wages. They do a lot for the purchasing power of households, but it's not at all clear that in a society whose per capita income is way below the average of the United States, you want to have exactly the same minimum wage as the rest of the country. An offsetting element would be the earned income tax credit, but it is not applied symmetrically to the residents of the island. Puerto Rico ought to be an exporter. Shipping is very important. There are huge and backward-looking and completely protectionist restrictions on the kind of shipping you can do, right? So yes, fiscal is key. We're talking about fiscal, but the next subject matter on the table necessarily has to be how will Puerto Rico grow? What will it make? How will it insert itself into the world economy? And that's a must for growth in the future.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on those remarks. It's hard for me to imagine any of the things in the paper, any of the to the extent any federal legislation is signed into law, that it wouldn't be paired with other policies. And we sort of know what the buckets of those are. There's regulatory at the federal levels with regard to labor policy. There's tax issues. There's spending level issues, and then I'm sure there'll be obviously some contemplation of legal policies. So it's hard for me to imagine any combination of any of those buckets and a control board coming together that didn't contemplate growth as part of it, and then presumably as part of any rule on the Commonwealth or any board, that those wouldn't be considered as part of the mix going forward, and that there wouldn't be, and I think you've spoken to that, the goal of putting together a long-term plan. And near-term fiscal rules are terrible. Long-term fiscal rules are more salient. Near-term fiscal rules don't really have any force because they get changed every year. We've seen that. So it's hard for me to imagine a successful fiscal rule not being contemplated over the long term, where you can think about the business cycle and you can think about some of these issues.
I just wanted to follow up on that too. The problem that we're facing is that we have this huge fire, which is the fiscal and financial situation, and we have to address that. We have to stabilize that. And that's basically taking up all the attention, and rightly so, in Puerto Rico and in the United States. But in terms of growth, though, as Tracy mentioned, economic growth is just not flipping a switch. There are no gimmicks, there are no silver bullets. Economists since Adam Smith actually have been writing about this, and there are many different theories as to what it takes. So what we have to do is, while we're dealing with the fiscal and financial issues, we also have to set up a mechanism to address the longer term economic growth policies at the same time that we're dealing with this fire. This is why this is so complicated. You know, turning around this aircraft carrier is going to take a while. But we have to begin now while we still don't know what's going to happen on the fiscal front. So we, 2 years from now, have a clear path for a policy to grow the economy that it's not imposed from the top down, either by the federal government or by the government of Puerto Rico. It has to have broad buy-in from stakeholders in the island. And this is the key in Puerto Rico. I mean, every 4 years, we come up with a new quote-unquote plan. I don't know of any business that can be run with, you know, changing its strategy every 3 years, every 4 years. So what we are trying to do at the center while we're dealing with the fiscal rules is also trying to set up a process, and we already are in conversations with some economists here in the United States and in Puerto Rico to develop a mechanism that will create a series of options for Puerto Rico, both at the sectoral level. This is very important. We cannot put all our eggs in one basket. So we have to look at a portfolio of economic sectors that we can grow, and what horizontal policies we have to improve, things like licensing, permitting, education, labor regulation, that need to be addressed at the Puerto Rico level in order to grow the economy over the long term. But again, this is way beyond the March 31st deadline that has been self-imposed by Speaker Ryan. I just want to mention that.
Let me just add my 5 cents on the federal minimum wage issue. Yeah, this is on the federal minimum wage issue. Hopefully, I'll put this to rest. Sergio agrees with me on this point. Let me first remind everybody, Puerto Rico is not Costa Rica. It is not the Dominican Republic. We are American citizens. We hop on a plane from one day to the next if we don't find a good job or the right opportunities down there. So you have to be careful when you do something like say, okay, let's make Puerto Rico now competitive with Nicaragua or Honduras. And you have to be very careful because we're part of the United States unless we become a sovereign nation, as I said before, which is one option we have, okay? Second, so if you reduce the federal minimum wage in Puerto Rico, I'll tell you what's gonna happen. By and large, you're gonna encourage people to actually rely on welfare benefits and engage in the informal economy, or in the alternative, leave the island. So for Puerto Rico at least, that shouldn't be on the table.
I just want to follow up on that comment. If you look at most of the literature that deals with the minimum wage, at least in the United States, usually one of the premises or assumptions is that the economy that's being modeled is at full employment. And full employment for economists doesn't mean that the employment rate is zero. It means the unemployment rate that is consistent with non-accelerating inflation. In the case of Puerto Rico, that's clearly not the case. We have a huge informal economy that it's estimated at anywhere between 15 to 30 or 40% of the economy. So if you make work in the formal sector of the economy even less attractive than it is right now, by lowering the minimum wage, you're not going to accomplish anything. You may get a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of businesses offering jobs at $5.25 an hour. You're going to get no workers lining up for that. People would rather take a plane to Miami on JetBlue for $100 one way and live in Miami with all the rights and benefits of a U.S. citizen. So my argument in that sense is it's technical in that you cannot transpose a lot of the literature that has been done on the minimum wage to Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico is not at full employment and it has a huge informal economy. And doing this will actually worsen, lowering the minimum wage will actually worsen that problem instead of improving it.
Can I throw one sentence in just for analysis of the panelists? There's also, which we haven't mentioned, and I think it should be part of the Puerto Rico analysis, there is a great and increasing demand for bilingual professionals in the United States. Mm-hmm. So Puerto Rico, one thing that is compounding our problem is not just our fiscal and economic situation down there, but the fact that there's a great demand for bilingual labor. Mm-hmm. So we're graduating nurses, we cannot keep our nurses. We're graduating doctors in our medical school, we're not keeping our doctors. We have a huge shortage of these professionals, even though we have high unemployment. Mm-hmm. Because every time we graduate a nursing class, they are offered $80,000 and $90,000 a job in Houston or in whatever up here. And I think that's significant because we are losing our tax base. The professionals that are leaving are creating an even bigger problem for us. And I think if we went into the lowering the minimum wage issue, it would be even worse.
We have time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to grab the questions that we have first, and then we're going to have the panelists and the speakers react. So let's start right here. Grab all the questions first.
Hi. Buenas tardes. Buenos días. First question. One of the reasons that you institute financial or fiscal control or fiscal control laws, let's say, or fiscal control boards, is because people get into mischief. People misbehave. And one of the reasons for mischief is the awarding of contracts. Now, Puerto Rico has a huge problem with this. There's incredible amounts of cronyism going on, and this has influenced the decision-making, which is rather poor at times on account of financial interests of the people who are in power at different points in time. I have not heard anybody in Washington or in Puerto Rico or anywhere explain to me or include as part of the fiscal control board or fiscal rule some type of way to regulate the awarding of contracts, which in Puerto Rico is a serious issue. And the second question I have is, I know the Centro, La Nueva Economía, has been working for some time on this industrial policy. What role does the federal government play in this industrial blueprint that you guys have been working on for some time? Thank you.
We had another question right here.
Hi, thank you. I think the point that Senator Batia made is really important in terms of no one discussing alternatives for the island. And it seems to me there's a huge contradiction in the US Congress discussing a control board when the United States itself is in a dire crisis as a result of the speculative policies that have been applied over the past number of years. Just look at Wall Street banks. The whole transatlantic system is crumbling. You may be aware that in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, there's legislation to discuss, excuse me, reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall law, which would separate speculative investment banks from commercial banks, which worked very well until its repeal in 1999, and it might be relevant for the case of Puerto Rico. Mr. Marswatch, you mentioned the case that Puerto Rico did not get into debt by itself. And obviously, I think we know that there were years of predatory lending to the island, and after the repeal of the law, which ended tax incentives for manufacturers and then left the island. I would ask you to comment on the proposal made on Monday by PPD Representative Natal, where he suggested a cessation of debt payment until there can be a full auditing of the entirety of Puerto Rico's debt, and then restructure that portion which would be deemed legitimate by the auditing commission. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to close up the questions and have the panelists react before we close the event. Please, anyway.
Well, I can address the rent-seeking question, which is the one that deals with procurement. And to a large extent, actually, the behavior we see in Puerto Rico from the private sector in terms of trying to game the system is precisely a product of the economic policies we have followed until recently, which is essentially granting either tax benefits to specific groups, the government picking and choosing winners, and granting government contracts. If back in 2006, we did an analysis with Stephen Davis, who's an economist at the University of Chicago, and we tried to calculate what exactly is the free market economy of Puerto Rico. And by free market, we mean let's count only businesses that do not depend to a significant extent on tax breaks by the government, special treatment by the government, or government contracts. And the number was surprisingly low. It was less than 20%. It was around 20, 21%, something like that. Whereas in the United States, it's over 50%, or even more than that. So, so the problem you're addressing is a direct function of the economic policy that the Puerto Rico government has been following over the last few years, decades actually. And that's where the industrial policy option that we are trying to present or trying to come up with comes into play. What we're trying to do is have first a set of academics look at the situation in Puerto Rico and draft a series of papers, not for the sake of drafting papers, but to frame an organized discussion based on facts and social science among the different sectors in Puerto Rico, private sector, the government, the unions, the civil society, just like what it was done in Ireland during the 1980s. And this is a very difficult endeavor, as you can imagine. It's a negotiation that it's different than a win-win typical deal, a business deal. And the reason why it is different is because each one of those groups that I mentioned has to come to that table to give something up today in order to gain something 3 or 5 years from now. And if you don't have the level of social trust that if I make, I say being a businessman, I commit to make this many $1 million in investments, but I am not confident that the government of Puerto Rico will not drive, its deficit through the roof, I will not make the investment. So what we're trying to set up is, with the help of people at Columbia University, is set up a process that has worked in other places, like Ireland and in South America and in Asia, that once we have a set of facts that everybody agrees, which granted in Puerto Rico that's very hard, but once we have that, then bring the stakeholders to the table and agree this is going to be Puerto Rico's economic strategy for the next 3, 5, 8 years, how many years it is, regardless of who wins the elections. This is the plan we're going to follow. So this is how we plan to address that. And again, we're already working on that, but as you can imagine, that's not a 2-month endeavor. That's going to take, a couple of years to get it done. That's why we need, as I mentioned in my remarks, some short-term measures to stabilize the economy and the fiscal situation. And once the patient is stabilized, we can build on that in terms of long-term growth. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to address
Yeah,
that.
just brief comments. We should vacate very soon, but
Sure.
yeah.
So building on this question of sort of economic growth and industrial policy and something that Senator Bhatia said about restructuring and financial control board going together, all these pieces are interrelated, and that's why this is really hard. There's this old story of Ulysses at the mast. How do you bind yourself? How do you bind your own future behavior when you have the power to undo it? And we've seen examples in Europe and other countries where they've blown through the Stability and Growth Pact and increased deficit targets, and now we have new automatic triggers in the 6-pack and the 2-pack, and it seems like there's a new rule every day. So you need this long-term commitment, and it's too bad that Lieutenant Governor Ravitch couldn't be here today, because I think he proposed something similar for the state of New York, where there was this external body, again, that sort of could help enforce discipline. So an external board of bondholders that would say, okay, we realize you can't get out of this problem right away, but we want to certify that you're moving toward budget balance, that you're moving toward growth. And I think that's the kind of model that we need to see here.
Okay, so I guess as much as I agree with everybody here, I guess I have a role to play to an extent in expressing some skepticism, which is, as I said earlier, is that context matters. And so it's all, I think we broadly agree that any legislation, any solution that we're going to see here will involve a mix of things, and some of it will involve, I'm sure, public expenditures. To a degree, there was obviously a discussion about restructuring, and folks have very strong views on what that ought to look like. But in the spirit of Congressman's remarks about compromise, is the context that we're thinking about is what could get enacted by this Congress right now, and what are the mix of options that we can see? We see, the administration coming at it from one perspective. We see the Republican House coming at it from a different perspective. We see the Republican Senate coming at it a different perspective. And so I think when I hear about not even being able to touch pensions, or when I hear about the administration's budget, when they finally put together a number for what the Medicaid number ought to be, and it's $30 billion, and you ask them, how do you want to pay for it? They say, you figure it out. When Medicaid is financed by the federal income tax, and we obviously know that that's a system in which Puerto Rico does not participate, and obviously parity with the Commonwealth has been a discussion that's been going on for decades, and I don't imagine it's going to be solved in an election year. But I would just, again, playing my role as skepticism, but also representing the perspective. If you're going to talk about a bill that has to get out of the Congress, and you're going to say, well, we need restructuring authority, and we need money, and someone asks, well, what comes along with that? What can people, in the context of equity, if you're going to say, well, we're going to have to borrow money from someone else, we're going to, depending on the nature of the restructuring, raise the borrowing costs of other subnational entities. I think that's a trade-off and a discussion that I think we need to have. So I'll wrap it up there.
We have to actually leave the premises now, but we thank you all very much for attending this panel activity and for joining in the conversation.